the anchor of the deep. The story based on Isaiah 41 verse 10. So do not fear, for I am with you, do not be dismayed, for I am your God. I will strengthen you and help you. The story, a fisherman was caught in a terrible storm. The waves were higher than his boat, and he felt like sinking. He remembered that God is bigger than any storm. He stopped looking at the waves and started focusing on God's promise. His fear didn't make the storm stop immediately, but it gave him the calm hands he needed to steer his boat safely back to the shore. Preface. The sea has always been a powerful metaphor for the human experience. At times, it is a mirror, flat, glass-like, and reflecting the peace we feel when life is going our way. But as anyone who has lived long enough knows, the sea can turn in an instant. This story was born from a single verse, Isaiah 41 verse 10. It is one of the most quoted promises in the Bible, yet it is one of the hardest to apply when the waves are higher than our boat. We often pray for the storm to stop, but God's promise is frequently about something much more profound, the strengthening of the soul and the steadying of the hands while the storm still rages. In the following pages, you will meet Elias. He is a man who thought he knew his faith until the horizon disappeared. His journey is a reminder that fear is not the absence of faith but an invitation to look at a different horizon. Chapter 1, The Village of Marah. The heritage of salt and stone. The village of Marah did not simply sit upon the coast, it clung to it with the desperate tenacity of a limpet to a storm-beaten rock. To the casual observer traveling the high ridge road, it was a picturesque cluster of gray stone huts, their roofs thatched with dried seagrass, huddled together as if for warmth against the eternal, salt-heavy breath of the Atlantic. But to those who lived there, Marah was not a postcard, it was a crucible. The air in Marah was never just air. It was a thick, briny soup that tasted of kelp and ancient tides. It got into everything. It rusted the hinges of the doors, it stiffened the wool of the blankets, and it settled into the lungs of the old men until their coughs sounded like the rattling of pebbles in a receding wave. Here, the rhythm of life was not dictated by a clock, but by the lungs of the ocean, inhaling at high tide, exhaling at low. Elias was a man carved from that very landscape. At 60 years old, his skin was the color of cured leather, mapped with a cartography of fine white scars, each one a souvenir from a snapping line, a sliding crate, or the sharp edge of a frozen net. His eyes were the color of the sea just before a rain, a deep, shifting gray that seemed to hold the weight of 1,000 horizons. When he walked, he did so with the sailor's roll, a gait designed to compensate for a world that was never level. The ritual of the Selah. Every morning, long before the sun had even thought of bruising the eastern sky with light, Elias performed his most vital task. He would walk down the cobblestone path, his boots clicking rhythmically, to where the Selah was moored. The Selah was a 14-foot dory made of mahogany and hope. She wasn't the fastest boat in the fleet, nor the newest. Her paint was peeling in places, revealing the silver gray wood beneath, but she was honest. In the language of the sea, an honest boat is one that doesn't hide its weight or its limits. Elias loved her with a quiet, fierce loyalty that most men reserved for their kin. He would sit on the narrow fort, the wood damp with dew, and reach into the pocket of his heavy wool coat. There, wrapped in an oilcloth to protect it from the spray, sat his Bible. It was a tattered thing, the spine held together by twine, its pages swollen and soft from the humidity. He didn't read chapters at a time. He didn't have the luxury of leisure. He would find one verse, a single beam of light to guide him through the day's labor. On this particular morning, his finger landed on a passage he had memorized as a boy. So do not fear, for I am with you, do not be dismayed, for I am your God. I will strengthen you and help you, I will uphold you with my righteous right hand. To Elias, these words were a comfortable heritage. They were like the thick sweater Martha had knitted for him, warm, familiar, and shielding. He believed them in the way a man believes in the floor beneath his feet. He took it for granted that the floor would always be there, silent and supportive, requiring nothing of him but his presence. His faith was sincere, but it was untried. It was a harbor faith, built on the solid ground of routine. The pressure of the world. As the sun began to peek over the edge of the world, casting a long, golden finger across the harbor, the village began to stir. The clink of metal against wood, the rhythmic slap-slap of water against the hulls, and the distant, lonely cry of a gull signaled the start of the workday. But beneath the beauty of the morning, a hidden pressure was mounting in Elias's chest. Faith is often easiest when the ledger is balanced, but Elias's ledger was tilting. 3 months ago, a rogue swell had snapped the Selah's rudder. Miller, the village shipwright, a man whose heart was as hard as the oak he worked with, had extended Elias credit for the repair. 3 months, Elias, Miller had said, his voice like grinding stones. I can't eat promises, and neither can my apprentices. The 3 months were up. In Marah, a man's word was the only currency that truly mattered. If he failed to pay Miller, he wouldn't just lose his credit, he would lose his standing in the tavern, his place in the chapel pews, and the silent respect of his peers. The weight of the need began to crowd out the peace of the word. How often do we do this? We read the promise of God's provision in the morning, but by the time we've finished our first cup of coffee, the math of our debt has become louder than the voice of our Creator. We begin to look at the silver harvest, the quick fix, the extra shift, the compromise as our only salvation. The warning in the air. Elias checked his gear with practiced, mechanical efficiency. He checked the tension in the lines, the sharpness of the hooks, and the fuel in the small auxiliary engine. He was so focused on the physical preparation that he almost missed the spiritual warning. The harbor master, a man who had lost both legs to a great white in his youth, was standing on the pier. He was sniffing the air, his nose twitching like a rabbit's. The air's too sweet, Elias, the old man called out. Smell that? It's like crushed clover and ozone. When the air gets that sweet, the sea is getting ready to turn sour. Elias paused, his hand on the rope. He looked at the sky. It was a masterpiece of blue and gold. The water was as smooth as a sheet of glass. He felt the weight of the Bible in his pocket, then the weight of the debt in his mind. The debt was heavier. I'll be back before the tide turns, Captain, Elias replied, forcing a smile. The sea bass are running at the reef. One good haul and I'm square with the world. The sea doesn't care about your ledger, son, the harbor master muttered, but Elias was already pushing off. Leaving the known. As the gap between the Selah and the stone pier widened, a strange sensation washed over Elias. It was a momentary shiver, a cold draft that didn't come from the wind. It was the feeling of leaving the known for the unknown. He looked back at the village. The stone huts looked so permanent, so safe. Martha would be waking up soon, stoking the fire, and setting the kettle to boil. He imagined the warmth of the hearth and the safety of the walls. For a split second, he considered turning back. The harbor master's warning echoed in his mind. The sea doesn't care about your ledger. but the need pushed him forward. He turned the bow toward the Great Reef, 6 miles out into the deep water. He told himself he was being a provider. He told himself he was being a man of his word. He didn't realize that he was actually being a man of self, attempting to solve a spiritual pressure with a physical harvest. He patted his pocket, feeling the outline of the Bible. "Do not fear, for I am with you." The words felt like a lucky charm rather than a living truth. He was about to find out that God is not a charm we carry into our storms. He is the anchor that holds us when the boat is gone. The engine of the Selah hummed, a steady, reassuring thrum. Elias watched the shoreline of Marah shrink until the houses were just tiny pebbles on the horizon. He was alone with the Atlantic, moving toward the great dark, unaware that his comfortable, harborside faith was about to be stripped away to make room for something far more beautiful and far more dangerous. Chapter 2: The Deceptive Calm. The Trap of the Golden Hour. The journey toward the Great Reef was a passage through a cathedral of light. As the Selah moved further from the safety of Marah's harbor, the world seemed to expand into an impossible vastness. The sky was no longer just a ceiling, it was an ocean of its own, painted in long, bleeding streaks of gold, copper, and a soft, bruised lavender. The water beneath the hull didn't just look calm, it looked motionless, a gargantuan sheet of polished obsidian reflecting the morning star with such surgical clarity that Elias felt as though he were sailing through the heavens themselves. In the lore of the North Atlantic, this is known as the false peace. It is a meteorological anomaly where the atmosphere becomes so heavy and pressurized before a massive front that the sea goes glass flat. To a seasoned sailor, it is the silence of a held breath. It is the ocean's way of drawing back its fist. But Elias, usually a man who could read the water like his father's handwriting, was blinded. He wasn't looking at the horizon with the eyes of a mariner, he was looking at it with the eyes of a debtor. The siren call of the reef. The Great Reef was a treacherous, jagged spine of volcanic rock 6 miles out, where the continental shelf plummeted into the abyss. Ordinarily, the currents there were so violent that they would toss a 14-foot dory like a splinter in a whirlpool. But today, the reports from the early bird scouts were whispering of a miracle. The water at the reef was as still as a village pond. The silver harvest, the massive schools of sea bass, were congregating in the deep crevices of the rock. A single successful haul there could yield more than a month's work in the coastal shallows. It could pay Miller the shipwright. It could fix the leaking roof of the cottage. It could buy the peace of mind that Elias felt slipping through his fingers. "Just 4 hours," Elias whispered, his voice sounding thin in the immense silence. "Out to the reef, cast the long lines, and back before the noontide." He checked his watch. 6 a.m. He felt the weight of the Bible in his pocket, a silent passenger. He leaned on the tiller, his leather-skinned hand steady, but his heart was hammering a rhythm of nervous anticipation. The warning ignored. About 3 miles out, Elias passed Thomas, a younger fisherman who was already heading back toward the harbor, his boat, the Mercy, oddly empty of fish. Thomas was barely 30, but he possessed that strange, biological radar that some men of the sea develop, a sensitivity to the weight of the air. As the two boats passed, Thomas cut his engine. The silence that followed was jarring. "Elias! Turn it around, man!" Thomas shouted, his face tight with a concern that looked like fear. Elias throttled back, the Selah coasting on the glassy surface. "The fish are at the reef, Thomas. Why are you heading in? The water is like a mirror." "It's too quiet, Elias," Thomas replied, gesturing toward the southern horizon. "The glass is dropping. I checked the barometer at the station before I left. The needle is falling like a stone. My joints are screaming, and the old-timers are saying there's a great dark coming up from the tropics. Look at the gulls, man. Look at the gulls." Elias looked up. Thomas was right. Usually, the air above the reef was a chaotic, screaming white cloud of gulls and gannets. Today, the sky was empty. Far to the west, he could see them, hundreds of white specks heading for the inland cliffs, flying low and fast. They weren't hunting. They were hiding. "The Lord provides, Thomas," Elias shouted back, using the scripture as a shield for his stubbornness. "I'll be back before the first shadow crosses the sun. I can't pay my debts by sitting on a dry dock watching birds." Thomas shook his head, a look of genuine pity in his eyes. "There's a difference between trusting God and testing Him, Elias. Don't let the harvest blind you to the horizon. If that front catches you at the reef, you've got no cover." But Elias had already pushed the throttle forward. The thrum of the engine drowned out any further warnings. The weight of the atmosphere. By the time Elias reached the reef, the air had changed. It hadn't become windy, it had become heavy. It was a thick, metallic weight that smelled of ozone and wet earth, the scent of a world about to be torn apart. The lavender in the sky had curdled into a sickly, bruised purple, and the sun looked like a pale, sickly eye peering through a shroud of gray gauze. This is the true life reality for many of us. We enter seasons of life where everything looks perfect on the surface. Our careers are running, the fish are biting, and the horizon looks like gold. We ignore the creaking joints of our intuition or the warnings of brothers because we are so focused on the harvest. We convince ourselves that God's favor is measured by the size of the catch, rather than the safety of the soul. Elias began to cast his nets. The work was grueling, and he was alone. Usually, the physical labor helped him pray, but today, his prayers were transactional. "Lord, just give me 60 base. Just enough to clear the debt. Just enough to prove I was right to come out here." He was so engrossed in the mechanical rhythm of the haul, the wet rope sliding through his calloused palms, the silver flash of fish in the dark water, that he didn't notice the horizon had disappeared. The arrival of the great dark. It wasn't a gradual sunset. It was as if a giant, cosmic hand had pulled a charcoal shroud over the world. From the south, a wall of clouds rose, not puffy or scattered, but a solid, terrifying fortress of ink-black vapor. It moved with a speed that defied the laws of physics, swallowing the distant cliffs, then the sea, and finally the sun itself. The temperature plummeted 20 degrees in a matter of seconds. Elias stood in the center of the sela, his hands suddenly cold. The first net was halfway in, heavy with the very base he had craved. But as he looked at the approaching great dark, those fish suddenly felt like lead weights dragging him toward a grave. A low, vibrational thrum rose from the depths of the ocean, vibrating through the hull of the boat and into the soles of his feet. The water didn't ripple, it began to heave great, slow, muscular swells that had no foam, just a terrifying power. "I have time," he whispered to the darkening air. It was the lie of a man who realized he had traded his life for a ledger. He reached for the knife to cut the nets, to flee the reef, but before the blade could touch the rope, the silence was shattered. The false peace was over. The wind didn't build, it exploded. A roar like 1,000 freight trains tore through the air, and the first wall of water rose up to meet him. Elias realized, with a soul-crushing dread, that he had walked into the maw of the abyss with his eyes wide open. He had the word in his pocket, but he had the world in his heart, and the sea was about to demand an accounting for both. Chapter 3, The Maw of the Abyss. The Anatomy of Dismay. The first wave didn't arrive with a splash or a spray, it arrived with the sound of a mountain being ground into dust. It was a vertical wall of obsidian water, nearly 20 feet high, moving with a predatory, cold-blooded grace. When it hit the sailor, it wasn't a liquid impact, it felt as though a battering ram of solid concrete had been swung by a titan. The boat groaned, a deep, structural shriek of mahogany and oak that vibrated through Elias's boots and into his very teeth. Within seconds, the glass-flat sea of the morning had vanished, replaced by a chaotic, moving landscape of liquid peaks and lightless valleys. The world had tilted on its axis. Elias was thrown across the deck like a discarded doll. His left shoulder collided with the mast with a sickening thud, and for a moment, the world turned white. Pain flared, hot, sharp, and electric, radiating down his arm and stealing the breath from his lungs. He lay there for a heartbeat, gasping, as the salt-heavy wind tried to peel him off the wood. But he had no luxury to nurse the injury. Before he could even scramble to his knees, the sailor dived into a trench. The bow dipped so low that for one terrifying second, Elias saw only the dark, roiling depths beneath him. Then, a second wave crashed over the front, filling the boat with knee-deep, churning foam. The weight of the gale. The wind was no longer a sound, it was a physical weight. It was a howling, invisible beast that tore the air from his mouth before he could swallow it. It screamed through the stays and the ribbons of his torn sails, a high-pitched, demonic whistle that made his ears bleed. Elias crawled toward the tiller, his fingernails digging into the wet deckboards until they bled. Every muscle in his body was locked in a primal battle against gravity. In the village of Marah, he was a respected elder, a man of routine and dignity. Here, he was nothing more than a wet, shivering speck of protein and bone, clinging to a piece of wood in an uncaring universe. This is the true nature of a crisis. It is a great leveler. It strips away the titles we've earned, the money we've saved, and the history we've built. In the maw of the abyss, Elias wasn't a man of God or a respected fisherman. He was a prey animal. He reached the tiller, his hand closing around the wood, but a rogue swell hit the rudder with such force that the handle kicked back, nearly breaking his wrist. He realized with a jolt of pure, cold adrenaline that the sailor was no longer under his command. She was being played by the sea, a toy in the hands of a giant. The psychology of the abyss. For the first time in his 60 years, Elias felt true, unadulterated dismay. In the modern world, we use that word to describe a mild disappointment, but the biblical root of the word is far more violent. To be dismayed is to be broken into pieces. It is the moment the internal structure of a human being collapses under the weight of an external force. Elias looked at the waves, each one higher than the last, and felt a hollow, cold vacuum open in his chest. His heart hammered against his ribs like a trapped bird. He began to do the math of the damned. He looked at the height of the water, then at the depth of his hull. He looked at the strength of the wind, then at the weakness of his one good arm. The answer the waves gave him was a resounding, crushing no. He stopped looking for the shore. He stopped looking for Thomas or the lighthouse. He was staring only at the how of his destruction. He began to imagine the water filling his lungs, the cold numbing his brain, and the way his body would eventually settle into the silt of the reef. By focusing on the process of his failure, he was inviting the failure to take root in his soul. The giants in the dark. In the middle of a storm, the human brain does something dangerous. It begins to personify the problem. To Elias, the waves were no longer just water and kinetic energy. They had become sentient. In his mind, they grew taller than the giants of old. He saw faces in the foam, ancient, watery spirits that had been waiting for him since the day he first set foot on a boat. "I am going to die," he whispered. The words were immediately snatched by the gale, but they echoed with thunderous volume in the silence of his mind. He was no longer a fisherman, he was a speck of dust. He had lost sight of the boat, even though he was touching it. He had lost sight of himself. He had become his circumstance. He was dismay personified. He slumped against the tiller, his eyes stinging with salt and the bitter tears of a man who realized he had been a fool. He thought of the debt to Miller. How small it seemed now. How insignificant the silver harvest was compared to the simple, beautiful gift of a dry floor and a breath of air. He reached into his pocket and felt the oilcloth-wrapped Bible. For a second, a flash of anger surged through him. Where is the righteous right hand now? He wondered. Where is the help promised in the morning? He didn't realize that the help was already there, but he couldn't see it because he was too busy measuring the giants. He was waiting for the storm to stop so he could believe, while God was waiting for him to believe so he could survive the storm. The sailor dived again, deeper this time, into a valley of water so dark it felt like the very center of the earth. As the next wall of obsidian water rose above his head, Elias closed his eyes and let go of the tiller. He had reached the end of the man. It was time for the beginning of the miracle. Chapter 4, The Anchor of the Word. The shifting of the gaze. At the height of his terror, when the salt had scoured the skin from his face and the noise of the gale had become a deafening, white noise scream, Elias reached the absolute end of himself. It was a cold, hollow place. His fingers were too numb to feel the grain of the wood beneath them, and his mind was a fractured mess of regrets, unfinished business, and the sheer, primal instinct to stop fighting and let the water take him. He was pinned against the mast, the sailor pitching so violently that the horizon, if it could even be called that, swung like a pendulum between the black sky and the blacker deep. He felt the cold weight of the Bible in his pocket, pressed against his ribs. For a fleeting, bitter moment, it felt like nothing more than a heavy stone dragging him toward the bottom. But then, deep within the cellar of his soul, a fragment of his morning ritual began to surface. It didn't arrive like a thunderous voice from the heavens to rival the storm. It wasn't a choir of angels or a sudden light breaking through the charcoal clouds. It was a quiet, insistent vibration, a rhythmic pulse that beat against the walls of his panic. Do not be dismayed, for I am your God. The failure of the internal ruler. Elias squeezed his eyes shut, his forehead pressed against the wet mahogany of the mast. In that darkness, he realized with a clarity that only comes at the brink of death why he was failing. He was failing because he was trying to measure the storm with his own strength. This is the measurement trap that every human falls into during a crisis. When the doctor gives the diagnosis, when the bank sends the notice, or when the relationship collapses, we instinctively pull out our internal ruler. We measure the height of the debt against our bank account. We measure the depth of the grief against our emotional capacity. We measure the speed of the wind against our ability to hold the wheel. And in every one of those calculations, the answer the waves give us is a resounding, crushing no. Elias had been looking at the waves to see if he could survive them. He was looking at the how of his destruction. He was analyzing the physics of the water, the angle of the boat, and the weakness of his 60-year-old frame. As long as he looked at those things, the math of despair was the only logic left. If the wave is 20 feet and the boat is 14, the result is death. It was simple arithmetic. "I am looking at the wrong thing," Elias gasped, his voice a ragged whisper that was immediately whipped away by the wind. The great pivot. He forced his eyes to open. He didn't look at the horizon, for there was none. He didn't look at the waves, for they were still mountains of obsidian death. He looked upward, not at the physical sky, which remained a ceiling of charcoal and lightning, but at the truth he had recited for decades. He realized that the promise in Isaiah wasn't a guarantee that the boat wouldn't take on water. It wasn't a promise that the storm would evaporate the moment he prayed. It was a promise of identity and presence. "For I am your God." The weight of that phrase hit him harder than the water. If the one who spoke the oceans into existence, the one who gathered the waters in the hollow of his hand, was his God, then the waves weren't the highest authority in the room. They were just scenery. They were powerful, yes, but they were subject. Elias began to shout the verse into the wind. At first, it was a desperate plea, a drowning man's scream for a life ring. But as he repeated the words, his tone shifted. He began to shout the verse not to convince God to help him, but to remind himself that God already was helping him. The word became an anchor, not an anchor cast into the seabed, which was miles below and unreachable, but an anchor cast into the eternal. "You are my God," he bellowed, his lungs burning. "You said you would strengthen me. You said you would help me." The anatomy of the anchor. In physics, an anchor works by creating resistance against a force. In the Spirit, the Word of God works the same way. As Elias shouted the promise, he felt the internal dismay, the breaking into pieces, begin to reverse. The fragments of his mind began to pull back together. As he shifted his focus from the circumstance to the promise, the fear didn't magically vanish. This is a common misconception, that faith is the absence of fear. True faith is the management of fear. For Elias, the fear changed shape. It was no longer a paralyzing weight that kept him pinned to the deck. It became a sharp, clear energy. It was as if his adrenaline had been sanctified. The great dark was still there, the waves were still 20 feet high, and the sailor was still half submerged. But Elias was no longer looking at the waves as monsters. He began to see them as obstacles to be navigated. He was no longer a victim of the ocean. He was a partner with the creator of the ocean. This is the psychological pivot of the believer. We stop asking, "How can I get through this?" and start declaring, "The one within me is bigger than the world around me." When Elias stopped measuring the waves and started measuring the promise, his perspective widened. He saw a line of foam to the port side, a break in the water that suggested a path through the crests. He saw a way to survival that his panic had previously blinded him to. He wasn't bigger than the storm, but he finally remembered that he was held by the one who was. With a grunt of effort that tore at his injured shoulder, he reached out into the dark, searching for the tiller. He was no longer looking for the end of the storm, he was looking for the strength to steer through the very next minute. "I am the fisherman," he whispered, "but you are the pilot." He gripped the wood of the tiller, and for the first time since the great dark descended, the boat didn't feel like a coffin. It felt like a vessel. The anchor was set. Chapter 5: The Miracle of Calm Hands. Supernatural strength in the struggle. The transformation was not mystical in the way the storybooks often describe. There was no sudden parting of the charcoal clouds, no shafts of golden light piercing the gloom, and no divine hand reaching down from the heavens to pluck the sailor from the churning deep. Instead, the miracle was quiet, internal, and profoundly physical. Elias reached out through the freezing, salt-laden spray and gripped the wooden tiller once more. Just moments ago, his hands had been shaking so violently he couldn't have threaded a needle, let alone guided a vessel through a gale. His fingers had been claw-like, curled into themselves with a combination of hypothermia and raw terror. His strength had evaporated, bled out through the dismay that had shattered his spirit. But as he settled into the truth of the promise, as he allowed the anchor of the word to take hold, a strange, heavy sensation began to flow into his extremities. His hands became heavy. It was not the heaviness of fatigue or the leaden weight of despair. It was a settled, immovable weight. It was as if his bones had been replaced with iron and his blood with a steady, rhythmic warmth that ignored the freezing spray. This was the strength promised in the ancient texts, not the explosive strength of a mythical giant who could crush mountains, but the steadiness of a saint who could remain unmovable while the mountains fell into the heart of the sea. The supernatural pilot. Elias began to steer. In the natural world, a 60-year-old fisherman with a battered shoulder and one eye clouded by salt should have been utterly overmatched by the physics of the North Atlantic. The sailor was a small dory, and the waves were what sailors call a confused sea, a chaotic jumble of peaks hitting from multiple angles, creating unpredictable vortexes of water. Yet, as Elias held the wood, he felt a precision that defied his 40 years of experience. Every time the sailor rose on a massive, heaving swell, he didn't fight the water with the desperate, jerky movements of a panicked man. Instead, he moved with it. He adjusted the rudder with microscopic accuracy, feeling the subtle shifts in the boat's center of gravity before they even occurred. It was as if he were being whispered to by the wind itself, told exactly when to tack and when to run. He felt a supernatural help flowing through his arms. When a rogue wave, a jagged, 15-foot peak of white water that could have easily rolled the dory, loomed to his port side, his calm hands moved instinctively. He didn't pull away in fear, which would have exposed the boat's vulnerable side, the beam, to the impact. Instead, he steered into the teeth of the wave, turning the bow just enough to slice through the wall of water like a knife. The sailor groaned, tons of water poured over the gunwales, and the boat dipped dangerously low, but she stayed upright. She lived because the man at the wheel had stopped fighting for his life and started trusting his guide. The peace that defies logic. The storm did not stop. If anything, the midnight hour brought a new, chilling ferocity to the wind. The rain was no longer falling in drops. It was horizontal, a million tiny needles of ice scouring the wood and the man alike. His muscles burned with a lactic acid fire that should have been debilitating. The cold was a constant, gnawing ache in his joints that threatened to lock his knees. Yet, Elias was no longer dismayed. There is a profound difference between being in a storm and the storm being in you. For the first 4 hours of the Great Dark, the storm had been inside Elias. It had occupied his thoughts, dictated his heartbeat, and paralyzed his spirit. But now, though the waves were still 20 feet high and the darkness was total, the storm had been evicted from his soul. He was a man on a mission. He began to see the waves not as the maw of the abyss, but as a series of gates to be passed through. He found safety not by reaching the shore was miles away and invisible in the blackness, but by finding his unmoving point within the chaos. A true life lesson in steady hands. We often spend our lives praying for God to change our circumstances. We want the waves of our financial stress to flatten into a calm sea. We want the wind of our family's conflict to die down instantly. We want the great dark of our grief or depression to be replaced by an immediate, sunny afternoon. But God's most frequent miracle is the miracle of the tiller. He doesn't always take us out of the storm, He makes us capable of navigating it. He gives us calm hands in the middle of a hospital waiting room while we wait for news. He gives us steady eyes while we look at a pile of unpaid bills. He gives us a quiet spirit while the world around us is screaming in a panic of politics, rumors, and fear. Elias worked through the night, his tattered Bible tucked safely against his chest beneath his oilskins. He was exhausted, but he was buoyant. He realized that the strength God provides isn't a one-time gift of power, it is a continuous, moment-by-moment help. He didn't have the strength to survive the whole night at once, he only had the strength to steer through the next wave. And that, he realized, was exactly enough. As the hours bled toward the pre-dawn, the great dark began to thin from a deep ink to a bruised purple. The wind lost its razor edge, shifting from a roar to a heavy sigh. Elias's hands remained steady on the wood, salt-crusted, scarred, and trembling with physical fatigue, but filled with a peace that surpassed all understanding. He had learned the secret of the sailor: you don't need the storm to stop to find safety, you just need to know who is holding your hands while you steer. He was no longer a victim of the sea, he was a student of the grace that governed it. Chapter 6: The Morning Shore. The wisdom of a storm-tested faith. When the first light of dawn finally broke over the eastern horizon, it did not arrive with a fanfare of trumpets or a sudden, dramatic clearing of the sky. It came as a weary, bruised gray, slowly bleeding into a pale, watery yellow that looked as exhausted as Elias felt. The light revealed a world that had been violently rewritten by the night's fury. The Atlantic was no longer a mountain range of obsidian, it was a vast, restless plain, heaving with the muscular aftershocks of the gale. The sailor was a ghost of her former self. Her sails, which had been his pride, were no longer canvas, they were ribbons of gray lace fluttering uselessly in the dying breeze. Her paint, once a proud nautical blue that matched the summer sky, had been literally stripped away by the scouring force of the salt spray and sand, leaving the raw mahogany weeping and exposed. She was battered, scarred, and sat dangerously low in the water, taking on a slow, rhythmic gulp of sea with every swell. But she was afloat. And so was he. The harbor of perspective. As Elias guided the boat toward the narrow, stone-walled mouth of the harbor of Marah, he saw the pier. It was crowded. In a small village like Marah, a great dark was not a private event, it was a communal tragedy. The villagers had spent the long, howling night huddled in the tavern or the stone chapel, listening to the wind and mourning the man they were certain had been claimed by the deep. No 14-foot dories survived a night like that. Thomas was the first to reach the edge of the dock, his face pale and eyes red-rimmed from a night without sleep. When the silhouette of the sailor finally appeared through the morning mist, battered but upright, a collective gasp, half-sob and half-cheer, rose from the crowd. Thomas jumped down onto the lower ledge of the pier, reaching out to grab the brine-soaked lines. Elias, standing at the tiller with the posture of a man who had aged 10 years and yet grown 20 years younger in spirit, tossed the ropes. His hands were steady. They didn't fumble the knot. They didn't shake with the tremors of a survivor. They moved with a deliberate, quiet authority that silenced the chattering crowd. "Elias! By the heavens, man!" Thomas cried, his voice cracking as he hauled the boat flush against the stone. "We thought the sea had taken you. We saw the barometer, it was the worst drop in 50 years. How did you stay upright? The waves were 20 feet at the reef." The secret of the calm hands. Elias stepped off the boat and onto the pier. His legs were wobbly, the sea legs that every sailor gets after a long bout with the waves, but as his boots hit the solid, unmoving stone of Marah, his spirit felt more grounded than it had ever been. The villagers crowded around him, throwing heavy wool blankets over his shivering shoulders and offering mugs of steaming broth. They wanted a story of a great battle. They wanted to hear how he had fought the waves with his bare hands or how he had outsmarted the wind with his legendary skill. Elias looked down at his hands. They were raw, the skin broken at the knuckles and crusted with a mixture of dried salt and his own blood. They were the hands of a man who had worked the hardest night of his life. But he looked at them with a strange kind of reverence. "The waves were high, Thomas," Elias said softly. His voice was raspy, the sound of gravel over silk, scarred by the intake of salt air. "They were higher than my mast. They were higher than my courage. In truth, they were higher than my life." He paused, looking back at the sail bobbing in the safety of the harbor. "But I stopped looking at them. I spent the first half of the night trying to survive by measuring the water against my own strength. I almost sank because I was so busy being dismayed by the howl. But then I remembered the word. I stopped measuring the storm and started measuring the one who made it." The crowd went silent. In the village of Marah, many people went to church, but few had ever spoken of God with such terrifying, first-hand familiarity. "God doesn't always stop the storm, Thomas," Elias continued, looking the younger man directly in the eye. "Sometimes he lets the boat take on water. Sometimes he lets the sails tear. But he always holds the hands of the man at the wheel. I didn't survive because I was a great sailor. I survived because I was a helped man." The new life on the shore. Elias walked home through the winding, cobblestone streets of Marah. The village looked exactly as it had 24 hours ago, the same gray stones, the same smell of peat smoke, the same rusted hinges. But to Elias, everything had changed. The debt to Miller the shipwright was still there. In fact, it was worse now, as the sailor needed a total overhaul to ever fish again. The physical pain in his shoulder was still throbbing, a reminder of his collision with the mast. The real world had not been magically fixed by his spiritual experience. But the man had been fixed. This is the final, most profound lesson of the anchor of the deep. The purpose of the storm is not just to get us to the other side, it is to change who we are when we arrive. A faith that has been nurtured in the deceptive calm is a beautiful thing, but it is a fragile thing. A faith that has been forged in the great dark is something else entirely. It is iron. It is an anchor that can no longer be shaken by a bad report, a falling barometer, or a rising wave. Elias knew now that no matter what the future held, be it sickness, further debt, or the eventual twilight of his own life, he would never be truly dismayed again. He had discovered the anchor of the deep. He had learned that the strength promised in Isaiah 41 verse 10 was not a feeling he had to conjure up, it was a presence that would never leave him. He reached his small stone hut and saw Martha standing in the doorway, her apron clutched in her hands, her face lit by the rising sun. He didn't show her the fish, there were only a few silver-scale bass left in the hold, the rest having been washed away by the sea. He showed her his hands. Steady. Calm. Ready for whatever the next tide might bring. Elias had walked into the storm a fisherman who knew about God. He walked out of it a witness who knew God. And in the village of Marah, long after the sailor was retired and Elias was laid to rest, they still told the story of the night the great dark met the man with the calm hands. They told it to their children when the wind began to howl, reminding them that the size of the wave never matters as much as the hand that holds the tiller. A final prayer for the reader. Heavenly Father, I lift up the person holding this book right now. You know the exact height of the waves they are facing. You know the weight of the great dark that is settled over their heart. I pray that, like Elias, they would feel a supernatural steadiness enter their hands today. When the wind howls and the how of their situation feels overwhelming, remind them of the who. Remind them that you are not a distant God watching from the shore, but the master of the sea who is right there in the boat with them. Strengthen their weary arms. Steady their anxious hearts. Replace their dismay with the quiet, ironclad peace that only your presence can provide. May they walk onto their morning shore with a story of your faithfulness that will encourage generations to come. In the name of the one who hushes the storm. Amen.